Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Morton Library, the Morton Memorial Library. One of our favorite places to have events because you can escape the outdoor air in here. I'm Dick Hermans. Welcome. And, by getting a minute, you know our guest speakers. But I'll introduce him nonetheless. He's a native of Poughkeepsie. He's a resident of Stottsburg. Thomas Wermuth is co-founder and director of the Hudson River Valley Institute. He's a Dr. Frank G. Buckness Chair in Hudson River Valley History at Marist University. Author of Rip Van Winkle's Neighbors, The Transformation of Rural Society in the Hudson River Valley, published by SUNY Press. And he serves as the publisher and chair of the editorial board of the Hudson River Valley Review, which is very nice. Welcome to Rhine Cliff, Tom.
Thank you very much. Very happy to be here.
The book we're talking about tonight, of course, is Freedom and Fire, Fire and Freedom, and the American Revolution in New York. It is a collection of essays. Tom was one of the editors. And I'm just going to start by saying, how did this project come together?
Okay, as the question kind of is coming together. Is the sound okay? Can you hear me okay now?
Yeah.
Well, actually, the project came together right around 3 years ago. It was in weather like this in late June or July of 2023. We knew, that the semi-centennial, the 250th anniversary was on the horizon. So I met with the editors of New York History, the journal. That would be Jennifer Mack and Devin Landon. And we were talking about what was the appropriate approach to try to make sure that New York got its due. They are historians, I'm a historian of New York. We wanted to make sure that, with 250th coming up, that there was some scholarly work about the revolution in New York that would be handed on, passed on from one time to another. We already, we knew there were going to be lots of celebrations, reenactments in 2026, again, the semi-quincentennial. But we wanted to make sure that historians down the road would be able to look back to 2026 and see what did historians at that time think about the revolution and the revolution in New York in particular. So that led to us coming up with what originally we thought was going to be a special issue of the Journal of New York History, which is published by Cornell University Press. Cornell liked it so much they wanted to turn it into a book immediately. And so that began a long process of many other people, of which my name just happens to be first. Many other authors that are in here, 8 authors altogether, another 3 or 4 folks who worked on the editing, helped me with that. But when we put out a call for papers back in 2023, we had about 50 folks respond, scholars and historians of New York. They put forward proposals. We went our way through that, and we ended up ultimately about 20 or so we wanted to know more about. We then put together another group of historians, about 30 of them, all thanked in the book, in the back pages, to act as called a blind review process, reviewing these various articles and chapters. And we came up with these 7 or 8 chapters that are very broadly representative of the Revolution in New York and different interpretations of it. For this book. So, that was kind of the origins of the book and ultimately how it came about. But also, just to add to that, that was a very taxonomic view of how the book came about, perhaps. But really, I also and the other people participating in this want to make sure that New York got its appropriate due as part of the revolution. It was recognized for its important part in the American Revolution. And I would argue, and that's what this book argues too, and we can do this during the discussion, it's the most important state, the most important colony in that state during the Revolution for a variety of reasons that I'll argue. We all know New England was the thing that started it, right, in the 1760s, 1770s, the Boston Tea Party, the shot heard around the world, all of those things, that Polar Bear's Ride, all those things are very true and very important. It happened there. And we generally know, right, most people would probably know a little bit about the end of the revolution comes in Yorktown, in Virginia, the Big Battle. That's the end of the Big Battle. Actually, the revolution continues another couple of years after that. But what's missing there in public knowledge and recognition, and I would even argue in the scholarly world too, because I've been watching C-SPAN for the past several months, C-SPAN 2, and they've been doing great stuff on the 250th of the revolution. Everything was focused around New England. Except occasionally they would kind of do a foray into Philadelphia, what was going on there. New York was fairly conventional. That part of that process is still to come, but a good deal of the interest that the public has in the revolution kind of probably came to a close last week, the July 4th celebration. Perhaps not, we'll see, because a big part of it happened in New York after that. So the point I would want to make is that, yeah, things started in New England, they ended in Virginia, but the major battleground of the American Revolution is New York. And George Washington spends a third of the revolution in and around New York and the Hudson Valley, and he's doing that because the British, they want control of that. And it's a series of contested battles every year, almost right through 1780, here in New York and in the Hudson Valley for a variety of reasons again, we'll see. So on the one hand, I wanted to make sure that something was being done about New York, and on the other hand, I really wanted to make sure that what was being done about New York recognized and represented the great scholarship which is happening here, but the colony and states, at some point there becomes the other important role in this process.
Yeah. I was impressed with these essays of how much they're actually not focused on. I mean, George Washington is
he's
inevitable, but it's not focused on the big things. It's focused on the impact on people, normal people's lives, average people's lives.
Yes, and that is, I mean, a lot of that has to do with where the historical profession has gone over the last several decades in terms of what it is that's being focused on, war, and so forth. Now, in terms of this, George Washington is in the book. You can't have something like a revolution without George Washington. And what is George Washington? It's actually the next to last chapter. It's a look at Washington was obsessed with getting New York City back because New York City fell to the British very quickly. Once the British got out of New England in early 1776, they wanted out of New England. It offered them nothing. It had no strategic value. They were getting shot at by New Englanders. So they wanted out, and they did it. And where did they go? The Howard-Brothers knew where they wanted to be the British commanders. They wanted New York City. And they wanted, of course, the Hudson River Valley, which was beyond it. And they held New York City for the entire war. New York City is occupied under martial law by the British from 1776 right through 1783, the Treaty of Paris, and the final troops leaving. Washington, the reason again he was always around the Hudson Valley was that's where the British were. So he was trying to protect the valley and also push back on the British. He wanted to gain control of, he wanted at very little cost to gain control of New York City, and that's really where that fits in until he learns he really can't. New York City.
I was surprised to learn that he did his own reconnaissance for that. This is the date of the war, but when they're deciding, are they going to fight in it for New York, or are they going to go down to Virginia?
Yeah, so he is, and it is the Grand Remonstrance that he's involved in, and he's doing it with the French, right? By this point, the French, there are more French fighting for the American side than there are Americans for the American side by this time in 17. The French have entered the war side. The Americans, not interested at all in helping the Americans, very interested in hurting the British as much as they could. The French were trying to convince him, right, working with Russell and others, don't try to win this. It's not going to, it's just going to be a blood and will not win it. And they're the ones that kind of work with Washington and redirect him down to Yorktown, although it is Washington's idea as well. But I just wanted to it's a demonstration of George Washington, which flies in the face of the question you asked, which is really on lesser folks that we know less about. I just wanted to assure you that George Washington does get his due as well. And it is about folks that perhaps had traditionally been seen on the periphery of the American Revolution. Perhaps their role was not as important. You know, for many years, historians tended to view the revolution as a fairly conservative event, actually. That they often when thinking about the revolution, they would compare it to the French Revolution. Well, the French Revolution, that's a revolution. That's where you have a reign of terror, king, family, the guillotine, and so forth, all of these things. The American Revolution, the argument was nothing like that. Or the Russian Revolution, similar things, czar being. And for many years, American historians, and in fact, when I was still in college, a professor I had made the very arguments I just said. The American Revolution, it's a war for independence, but it's really not so revolutionary. And that has changed in terms of the historical interpretations over the years, over the 1950s, 1960s, and 70s. As we've looked at the revolution as being richer, perhaps, than we had traditionally understood, because we tended to view it, earlier generations sometimes tended to view it through the prism of the war for independence against Great Britain, and we kind of lost sight of the fact sometimes that there's lots of other things going on here with the enslaved people of African descent, the first peoples, the Native Americans, the Loyalists, and their role in the revolution, those people who remained loyal to the crown. So those groups were always there, but kind of were seen as somehow, again, on the periphery, everyday soldiers, secondary to what was going on in terms of Great Britain. And what this book is attempting to do as well is take a look at that original research, but also looking at the vast literature that has happened over the past couple of decades, which has made the argument that the revolution is very much, the American Revolution is very much a revolution. It may not have had a reign of terror, but certainly First Peoples and the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois may have seen it differently. It did see it perhaps as a reign of terror against them. Others, like the Loyalists and the Tories, they're forced to, their land is confiscated. More land, percentage-wise, is confiscated in North America during the Revolution than at any other time in the 18th century, even more than occurred again in the French Revolution. So, and many of those groups are forced to flee. Some 60,000 Loyalist Tories, people of African descent who were enslaved, they flee with the British at the end of the war. And again, percentage-wise, that's a bigger part of the American population than during the French Revolution. So the point of all this, and I'll make this even more detailed over time, is that this is a real revolution. And the impact on groups that taking part was very real.
Yes, go ahead.
Well, I'm just going to add, because I was thinking that, I mean, part of this, and maybe this was the next question, I should have just held off. Why did that change, perhaps, too? Why did we start to look at many of those groups that we hadn't looked at as much before? And I keep on saying we, but really it's a generation or more. And I think a lot of that does have to do with the historical profession changed significantly in the mid-20th to late 20th century. Traditionally, your average historian, the overwhelming number of historians would have been from a more elitist background, more, I don't want to say elitist, but more elitist. But also, right, that's the term's not entirely important.
Less enlightened also.
Less enlightened, and there's reasons for that, but also they often came from privilege, and I mean that in the sense of wealth. They could afford many years of graduate school, right? And others that didn't make it that far. It's not until state universities start to produce PhDs and you start to see changes in rising number of fellowships at schools like Harvard or Yale and others, allowing other folks which otherwise would not have had the means to already going 4 years of school and another 4 or 5 years or whatever. And as these other groups began to move into the profession, they're moving into it at the same time that during the 1960s you have the civil rights movement which has emerged, you have the Vietnam War, the anti-war movement, the feminist movement, all these groups kind of challenging authority, including the authority of the historical profession of the university. And from that, you start to see real changes as more and more folks started to study more folks that were more and more like them, that they could relate to, right? And those folks, the sources were there. You just had to use them a little bit differently from the way people have been used to using them. That really opened up the historical profession.
So in this book, there's there's 7 amazing essays. One about the indigenous people and how they were pushed west, really at the urging of George Washington, who was really ready to let them out. And another about how slavery was ended in New York State. And I think, my sense was, okay, in 1828, it was ended in New York State. It took all that time for kind of piecemeal laws to be put in place to slowly get rid of slavery in the state.
Yeah, look, slavery in New York is a peculiar story in itself in terms of and how it ultimately was ended. Has a lot of richness to it as well. Because for many New Yorkers, Dutchess County regularly voted against ending the institution of slavery right up to the 1799 law, which did it. Ulster County, the same, the old Dutch farmers had numbers of enslaved people. It's also important to keep in mind that, in terms of New York was the largest slave society north of the Chesapeake. So we think of slavery as a Southern institution, which it was primarily, although every one of the 13 colonies under the Revolution had slavery. The first stop was Vermont, entering as 14. So slavery existed. It was a very important part, a very powerful part of New York City. Enslaved people of African descent worked on the docks, the wharves, the boats, the skiffs, they moved and transported things around. Probably 10 to 15% of the population of Manhattan, New York City at the time of the Revolution. It's not a very big place, 25, 30,000 people. About 10 to 15% are enslaved. Hudson Valley did the same. Make a recommendation if you haven't visited Huguenot Street, Huguenot Village lately in the past few years. I would recommend going. They've done great work over there in terms of kind of characterizing the institution of slavery as it existed from the very earliest years in the 17th century in the Hudson Valley. And it existed because it was profitable. It made profit and empowered the people of the valley and of New York City. That's why they enslaved. That's why they wanted slaves. The system was very different in New York and the Northeast than it was in the South. The South tended to be the big plantations and things like that. New York, the Hudson Valley, much more likely to have a family, have an enslaved person or two. Sojourner Truth would kind of fit that model, as well as Wagner across the river. They lived in the home with their enslavers. They lived in the cellars. They lived in the attics. Worked side by side, so it was a very different type of enslavement than existed in the South. I think it was very powerful and very important. Again, other states in the Northeast, in New England, Pennsylvania, the Revolution convinced them to bring an end to slavery. Not overnight, it was a gradualism involved, but they did bring an end to it. It was more powerful in New York. It fulfilled a more powerful role. And although during the Revolution you actually had the first calls for ending the institution of slavery, and there were always people opposed to slavery in the Hudson Valley. Quakers, the Moravians, and others that had been opposed to it for years. But the general population was not. During the Revolution, there is the call to end the institution, but it's many years before it does. But a great part of the article on enslavement in New York more generally is that it takes a look at, again, how people of African descent enslaved made this revolution their revolution. Right? Examples of various enslaved people. An enslaved person from northern Dutchess County. Her name was Rachel. That's all we know about her name. She was enslaved in the Wermuth, Rhinebeck area. I'm blanking, we do have the name of her enslaver. I'm blanking on that name right now. 1781, the war is on. She uses that opportunity to escape. She flees from her enslaver. About 2 or 3 days, she doesn't go far. 2 or 3 days later, she comes back and burns her house down, her enslaver's house down. And then heads off again. We know about all of it because it was in the Fugitive Slave Act that her owner or enslaver put out. Described her as a strong temperament. I guess so, in terms of working out. We don't know how she ended up, but her story is one of thousands of stories of enslaved African Americans. Several thousand flee from the Hudson Valley, from New England, from upstate New York, down into the British. The British aren't interested in slavery. In fact, they've already, through Hudson Memorial Proclamation and another proclamation right here in the Hudson Valley, any enslaved person that runs away from their rebel master, as opposed to the Tories and loyalists had slaves too, their freedom would be given to them. And in 1783, again, when those ships are leaving New York Harbor, they leave with not only loyalists, but some 3,000 enslaved, formerly enslaved people. Most of whom relocated to Canada, and that area. I'm trying to think, Prince Edward Island, some of the other, one of the places I mentioned. And they were given their freedom. So from their perspective, in terms of the revolution, here's the person who enslaves me is constantly yelling about his freedom that's being taken away, that he's enslaved by the British, and here I am enslaved by this person. So, and then there were thousands of fighting as well, both the British and the Americans. Ultimately, the British from a very early time, again, they're fine with using runaway enslaved in their army. Washington is at first hesitant for the first 2 years, in fact, of using enslaved, more for the reasons that you can imagine, the optics of it. He recognized that. But by 1777, 1778, 3 years or so into the war, there are African American regiments that are being raised as well, with the promise of freedom. Initially not to fight, to serve kind of behind the battleground, the home front in various ways, supply and things like that. But ultimately, before 1779, 1780, troops of enslaved African Americans, or formerly, are a big part of that, big part of the war. So now, in terms of the direction that slavery went, yes, that law of 1799 stated that anyone born after July 4th of 1799, any enslaved child of an enslaved person born, they get their freedom if they were female. I'm trying to think until like 25 years, they were male, like 27 years, something just like that. It was not, no one was free immediately based on that. They were been 25, 27 years. Now, what happened is that there were adjustments which took place over time, which reduced time. Some people put into more of a debt peonage type of position, less an enslaved position. And then at some point there, too, around about 1815, 1816, something has to happen with all the enslaved that were born before 1799. They're not part of this. So that is addressed through other legislation. But it was not a quick, easy process. What Lucian Holness, the author there of that piece, also points out is, again, not only did the counties I mentioned regularly vote against ending slavery, it was only ended when the new counties that were coming in western New York and New England were primarily settling. When they started participating in those votes in 1796, their votes which put an end to the institution. So it was a complex situation.
Yeah, the whole ebb and flow of Western Europe is really nice to spell out.
Yeah, it's a great story and very well told. And you mentioned the native peoples to the Seneca. Let's take a second on that. Because, yeah, the Seneca, of course, are one of the Six Nations by the 1770s. They are one of the, what we used to call the Iroquois, but now we call the Haudenosaunee. Iroquois and Trove is considered actually kind of a derogatory term, although Iroquois can still be used to describe the area of central New York that the Iroquois occupied. They, as the war breaks out, they know this is not going to be win for them. Right? And debates start immediately in 1775, 1776 among the Six Nations. They all come to talk about it. and you have different debates back and forth. And ultimately, you do have the Oneida and Tuscarora side with the Americans, whereas the other four nations, that's the break in the Iroquois, in the Haudenosaunee, the Covenant, the Keeper of the Flames. The other four go and fight for the British. They recognized that a British win gave them some hope. The British had always been trying to protect them in certain ways, the various lines of demarcation, of boundaries, of where settlers could go. The Americans wanted that very land that the Native peoples and the First Peoples were in. What this author, this is Alana Christian, who's at Santa, actually, wrote this piece on the Senate in particular. It points out that although, and they are a big part of the war, that in terms of none of the First Peoples, particularly in Seneca, are initially decimated by the war. In fact, they worked out a diplomatic relationship with the new United States for a couple of decades anyway, although you kind of have to feel, though it took a couple of decades, the writings on the wall now too, you see what direction it was going to head in. But, you made reference to, Washington's call to move the Iroquois out. It's one of the lesser known, maybe for the reasons that you described, major military excursions of the Revolution was something called the Sullivan Campaign, Sullivan-Clinton Campaign. And it was the second largest army that the Continental ever put together, and it came out of upstate New York and upstate Pennsylvania, and it converged and around the territory of Haudenosaunee, around what would be modern-day Syracuse area and things like that. And the target was exactly that. It was to, whether you're going to engage these army foes, not most of the people that the native people, women and children at this stage, the other men have been out as part of the military aspect. There were casualties immediately, not overwhelming. But what they did along the way, what the American armies did. By the way, Sullivan got a county named after him for this process. Was they burned and destroyed everything, and that was the order they had. Nothing. You want to create a place that no one wants to go back to. Was basically the argument, and they do. They decimated the countryside, and what they found, though, we have some of the recollections of some of the soldiers participating in the New York State Archives from the Sullivan Campaign. They spoke about when they came upon the Indian villages, which had been abandoned maybe just a few days before as groups were getting away. They were fascinated that the homes were better than the ones that they had left behind back in Massachusetts and New York. The amount of food that was growing, the melons, the corn, they were just stunned by this. This was not the impression they had of what they were going to find. And there was a historian years ago that called it the war against the vegetables, because the thing was, did destroy the countryside, did effectively. That did not end, though. Make no mistake about it. The First Peoples, Haudenosaunee, four nations again continued to fight with the British. Many were kind of pushed up into Canada following the Sullivan Campaign. They had no access to food, so the British had to take care of them that year. But others got back. It didn't end the threat there. And just as a side note, very often historical accounts, folks at the time referred to this as incredibly brutal, uncivil, and humane warfare that the native people did. They fought the same. They used the same tactics on either side. That both sides were brutal and inhumane in the way that they treated the
One other area was Long Island, where patriots had people sign like allegiance to the revolution, and then the British came along and said, "You sign this, and you're loyal to the king." It was like both things going on, and people not necessarily straightforward about what they were doing.
Right. Well, I mean, you have to be very careful in terms of the folks in charge. Might change.
It's just early in the war.
Long Island is, which would include Brooklyn and Queens and things in the 18th century. Long Island is a lot like Manhattan. It's taken over for the entirety of the war. Once the British take it in 76, they kind of have control of it for the next several years. But that article also does speak to that significance of loyalists and confiscation of land, which I think about, remember to come back to. But in terms of that action, the historian that Chris mentioned, who's written a lot on loyalism in New York, right, he has the whole list of folks who signed in 1775 the Association. The Association was a pro-revolutionary continental association. We're all going to join together, and a large part of the population of Long Island males. That's what signed. However, now those records exist. We also have the records that the see it's looked at very carefully of the British in 1777, loyalty to the king. Loyalty was the king. As you look at it, it's the same people that decided that. But the letter from the military governor there to, I guess it was done, I'm trying to think, maybe to Tryon, the governor of New York, was, everyone's, the support for the king here is to a degree that you wouldn't believe. Well, probably what would have been to a degree you wouldn't believe. Because folks who really, they were just kind of waiting what was going on around them. And what was going on around them, the British were in charge, and you better. This was not something you could get away without doing. The British regiment would show up at the door. You weren't signing. There was going to be a problem, right? So that tended to happen in many places that were occupied by British. But some big portion of those folks probably were loyalists and Tories. John Ellis said at the time of the Revolution that about a third of the folks who were revolutionary, about a third were loyal to the crown, and about a third just didn't want to buy. They didn't want to buy. Probably his numbers aren't that far off, because historians estimate that 20 to 25% of the American population were loyal to the crown. They viewed themselves, they were the people that were loyal. The revolutionaries were the troublemakers, they were the rebels. So some 1/4 of the population of Hudson Valley, York, other places were wanted to stay as part of the crown. And then another big chunk, maybe another 25%, were that group that really did want to be left alone. This was not their fight. They didn't see why they should get involved. They didn't live where the fighting was taking place. So probably less than half of the folks at the time of the 1770s and 1780s actually were in favor of independence in a regular way. Still a majority, or at least a plurality of folks. But it does also speak to one other thing, too. Something else about the Hudson Valley, which is very, very unique in terms of anyone. New York is very, very unique, different from the other 12 colonies and states. It is, again, as I started off in the first comment, it is the major battleground of the Revolution. It is between Westchester and Peekskill, it's so-called no man's land. Everything north of Peekskill, the Americans try to keep control over. Everything south of the modern Bronx area, the British tried to control. And they regularly fought back and forth. The British controlled the port, they controlled New York City. That meant that folks weren't going to be able to get their goods in and out. So the Hudson Valley suffers greatly. That major economic depression during the war, because they can't get out. They can't sell their wheat and flour. It's requisitioned, which meant that it was going to be confiscated by the American troops when they needed it. And they lost the market for goods coming in, because the British had control of that. So the Hudson Valley was not only the battleground, but the home front was the battle. The fighting was taking place throughout. And a big part of the Hudson Valley, how it weaves in here, is that different from the other states, there are a series of major feudal-like matters which control much of Hudson Valley society. Rensselaer, Livingston, Van Cortlandt, Phillips, these two other small ones important. Those 4 matters are the size of any county in New York. And there's a split there very often between those that remain loyal to the king and those Phillips. And if you were loyal to the king at the end of the war, that meant the land was being confiscated. And so a whole matter there, which would be Phillipsburg Manor, Westchester area, right? Probably southern Westchester. Hundreds of thousands of acres, which were opened up now to farmers who had been tenants on the land and now had access to, through an auction process, a democratic process of getting access to land. So some of the great stories of the Revolution are little things like that. Folks who, again, the reason they were tenants on any one of these estates was they took war to own home. Here they had the opportunity to do that. And you start to see an emerging middle class coming out of it. So the whole Long Island, in terms of the loyalist component, and discusses also the spy ring, but how this connects up to loyalism throughout North America, and New York in particular. It's important.
You think that loyalism of that age carried over to New York into the 19th century?
Into New York? In New York?
Yeah. It make New York more conservative space.
I would argue, no, I don't think so. Because again, no more so than any other state. Except the other states also do have loyalists, and some portion thereof. I mean, New York is just on the cusp of really kind of merging and blowing up as the Empire State. Right? It is, all the seeds are coming together. In fact, during the British there, in terms of the importance of that port, the agricultural land around, the natural transportation system we had with the Hudson, and that ultimately opening up into the Erie Canals. And New York became one of the more, even if this, New York is a progressive place in the 17th century. Think of New York as being a model of progressivism now. It was very progressive in the 17th century. The Dutch were settling it in the 17th century. They were wide open to whoever wanted to settle. They had no problems, as long as you were involved in commerce and were willing to trade, right? It's different from New England, where you better be a certain Puritan town, you better be a Puritan. So New York has a Dutch heritage. It has the English coming in. It has a mix of different cultures. Isaac Jones in the 17th century said on his visit to Manhattan, he heard something 13 different languages spoken during the course of his visit. New York was always different in terms of that. And of course, by the end of the 18th, early 19th century, it becomes a major place where immigrants are coming into New York.
All right. So we have this smart gentleman here. And so who has questions for you?
What are some of the other chapters?
Do this by heart at this stage, right? The first chapter, in fact, is on the formation of town governments in New York. It was completed by the New York Hudson Valley president, Dillon Streifenreiter. I think he's from Red Hook originally, in fact. He's now down at the U.S. Naval Academy, professor of history there. He's doing a lot of great work on, I mean, New York was not a very democratic place before the Revolution. Let's give the example of the tenants and the landlord. The tenants weren't allowed to vote. Some of these landlords, at least in Manhattan, just chose their representative to go to the New York Assembly. So you're not talking about employees that thrived on democracy. Some areas as the revolution breaks out, though, more and more folks are getting involved in the revolutionary process, and more the vote, the ability to vote and hold office was based on financial means, owning certain property, and so forth. And that starts to go by the wayside in the 18th century as well. So that's the opening chapter. Emily Smith, I think her chapter is next. It's on the Declaration of Independence, and that's a political document right from the start. It's, keep in mind that George Washington escapes from New York City in September of 1776, a couple months after the Declaration of Independence. The British are coming in from within a few days. The British have entered New York City. He leaves New York City because the British are down there with a huge army of 40,000. For those 2 months before that, we had independence, at least declared, the Declaration. And it uses the whole newspaper who made special printings of this so that people could, this was revolutionary, hang up in their homes by this point, they knew the British were out there in the harbor. They were out there in Staten Island, just waiting, building their army before today. So this was a political statement of sorts, that declaration by certain newspaper publishers to make your cause political, to make it clear what your cause was. I'm thinking the next chapter is on one of those very less studied areas. I wonder why. It's the burning of New York City. New York City, within a week of George Washington's leaving, as the British are coming in, somebody sets fire to New York City. A fifth of the city is destroyed. 25% of the population are homeless based on this. They really kind of know who did it. They weren't the British. The British wanted to take control of this. They want to burn it. It was some patriots. One of them was killed actually in the process. But there was always a sense, so it was the revolutionary side, which was burning, the rebel side, the patriot side, which had set it on fire. And there were wonderings at the time, did Washington order this? And really, his study is partly about that event, but partly about why did it fall out of view? Why is it that one of the biggest things that happens early in the war, Kingston gets burned every year. Right? New York City is burned in 1776, and it doesn't even come up again. It's there in the history books, but sometimes they're critical, sometimes they're saying, no way George Washington was involved in this. And Robert George Washington wasn't, but God forbid that should become the argument or the motif of the revolution. This thing that would be considered terrorism in the 21st century, right, in terms of that. So that's the next chapter. We spoke about the Seneca. We spoke about the Chivalrous on Long Island and enslaved people. And I fear, I think that's it. Russell Shorto, that's the opener. I have an intro. The Mike.
I'm just, one second, just make sure. So, New York was, late agreeing to independence in 1776, and had to, the delegates had to await further instruction. Which figures in New York were instrumental in determining that New York would follow that course of action?
So the question is, in terms of that, New York is the Declaration of Independence when it is voted on in July 4th of 1776. By the way, the Declaration was not really even needed. Independence was voted on July 2nd of 1776. And they could have just left it at that. They're going to figure out we're at war. But the Declaration of Independence is that great document which says so much about the Enlightenment of the 18th century, not the things about it so breaking away from Britain, but what it means to the citizens. That's the July 4th. And New York does not sign, does not vote. And so that's why it's, actually South Carolina didn't vote initially either. So it was 11-0 in terms of that, but they really kind of wanted it to look unanimous. But South Carolina was basically come on board. They get pretty quickly. New York did not have its, the New York Provincial Congress was meeting in Westchester, in White Plains. And they had not yet had their vote in terms of that. So people that would have been a very important part of the process would be one of the Robert Livings. There's three Robert Livings. There's multiple Robert Livings. Three that are living at one time. John Jay, definitely in terms of that. They probably would be two of the leaders. I'm just trying to think. I mean, there's a whole other group as well. These would be two of the most prominent, most powerful folks. Not the Delanceys, right? They were banking on staying with the British in terms of this, and they banked the wrong way. So those would be some of the key figures. The vote in White Plains was for independence. I don't recall seeing it was a close vote or whether the numbers are actually ever even released in terms of that. Just kind of came up. But yeah, it's an important story in terms of it. For about 10 days, it's the 12, unanimous on the 12th. And they really needed New York there. But by this point as well, they know, again, the largest naval expedition in British history until World War I occurs on the eve of the American Revolution in July 1776. The British armies that had been in New England under William Howe, but new British armies and the British Navy under the control of his brother, Richard Howe. The Howe brothers ran the revolution from the British side for the first 2 years, and William Howe had been outspoken about it was a bad idea to try to stop the revolt, basically. They had arguments, better to work something out diplomatically. That's the guy that the British put in charge of winning the war. They're out there, again, in the harbor, building up in June, July, and August, at the same time that the Declaration of Independence is being argued back in Philadelphia, but New Yorkers are watching what's going on. Yes. David.
I have two questions. I'm really happy that you have the book because I think from when we were in school, seeing about the revolution again, we didn't really do that sort of thing, and not so much about the importance of it. My two questions are, could you speak to, I know you can, but would you speak to the role of women in the revolution? Because that was something that I never really loved about other than, Betsy Ross and that sort of thing. But like the boycotts with the and things like that. And then the other thing I didn't really know about until I went to the local historical site about the South Declaration in 1775, where on the side they had their own kind of like mini declaration.
Yeah, I don't know much about exactly beyond what you just described. I mean, keep in mind, the communications are relatively weak from one place to the next. Notice might be received from one town to the next if something had happened, and you start to see similar activities break out in other towns. Collaborate actually had something similar as well in terms of that. So I think, again, I can't speak to Kentucky any more than what you've already said, but you would find other communities, primarily in New England, where that would have been common. In fact, that was the word that went out from the assembly to the town governments, the townships, was to have a meeting, making clear what your position was on something, and the position almost invariably came down in favor of helping Boston and stopping the British front. On the first part, yes, in terms of women, I mean, there's certain things we've known for many years in terms of as men were fighting in the wars, and a healthy part of the population did fight, although the vast majority did not. We know that wives and mothers and daughters took over a variety of activities that had traditionally been those of their husbands or fathers in terms of keeping the farm, which would not have been unusual to begin with, since it would have been common for farm women to work in many of the same areas at certain times as farm men, although they might have control over certain other types of things like chickens and things like that. Different. But the other thing, which is, and women, of course, signed things like they had beads, sewing, things like that. And they also were signatories to the association, the same thing that actually was being referenced in Long Island. And the Continental Association was, women were allowed to sign that because what they were saying was they were not going to buy British goods. They were going to make their own, right? Homespun as necessary or other things. And that's why some historians have argued, Martin Clark Smith has made an argument that the movement of women during the Revolutionary period on some of these things reveals, their arguments for boycotts and things like that, reveals kind of a pre-capitalist mentality. They're trying to rebuild old communal networks that had existed previously, but also gain greater control over goods that were being produced in North America, which goes a long way with breaking away from Britain. The other thing you mentioned too, though, yes, there's a topic I'm very interested in, I've been working on myself for years, and just haven't been able to finish it, is the number of price riots and food riots and things which took place in the Hudson Valley. Hudson Valley was the premier place for price riots, market riots, seizing the various goods, and it was overwhelmingly women-led groups which participated in these. We know about, at this stage, maybe about 45 that took place in about 8 different states in the Northeast. About 15 of them, clear plurality, took place in the Hudson Valley, between North and Westchester and Kingston, I would say, probably. And very often these are aimed at storekeepers that were either hoarding goods or price gouging. They actually had terms. There's a whole economic culture, a variety of old medieval-like terms describing things like regrading and engrossment and forestalling. That all of those things are some form of price gouging or hoarding. And so it was not uncommon for these crowds to come to the storekeeper's door. Often, front door, the storekeeper knew who they were. They went to know they were his customers. They didn't do anything to try to disguise themselves. Often they needed salt, preservative, something which would be essential, which had been lost in with the British takeover of Manhattan, losing. They want tea. It was always viewed as an absolutely essential, necessary product. Flour and wheat, when Gus was being used by the army. So these tended to be the items which the various crowds were searching for. Often, and they just moved people out of the way who were going to in any way prevent them. You know what happened with Merchant Willie Nelson. He had assault after he tried to convince them that he didn't have it. They didn't believe it. In fact, they were right. He was counted. They had a lot. And they took that and they left. Here's the thing. They would argue they were not stealing it because they left what they considered the customary price, the just price. Again, another medieval idea. So this happened again in some 12, 13 different stores. One, a very famous one, right in not just a storage thing, Sears, storage thing. Sears was a storekeeper whose shop was raided 3 times by female-led crowds over the course of like 2 weeks in 1777. And he had that because he went was deposed by the New York Provincial the Council for Deciphering Conspiracies. It's not deciphering, detecting conspiracies. And after he gives his deposition, which is actually in published form, the group basically says, you should really kind of work this out on your own with those. This isn't something we want to get involved in, basically, because they knew that was the popular strain. So that was a very important role that women played during the war in terms of getting often responses from the New York State government in terms of making sure that markets were regulated in ways they could have access to goods. There's also cases served in the Army as was in New Windsor. Remember, the American Army under George Washington was in New Windsor for the last year and a half of the war. I shouldn't have brought it up because I can't think of her name, but for the first 6 or 9 months, there were no issues. She was sick at a certain point, had to be treated by a surgeon, and that's when it was revealed. She was not drummed out. She was thanked for her service, which she had discussed herself as a man. That was relatively infrequent. That one of those things.
Before one more question, I'm going to say something I should have said at the beginning. Outboard does lots of events. Go to outboardworks.com, check it out. Thomas will be signing books after this. And, by submitting compensation on it. The store will have it for your Christmas gift. Sir.
Tom, since we know that there were about a dozen languages spoken in New York, you can presume that we had at least a dozen nationalities or ethnic groups there. Do we have any idea how these people split between loyalists and English crown and be a part of the devils? Is there anything about that?
That's a great question in terms of that. I mean, we know that, in certain regions where ethnicity played still a very, let's say, important part in how people understood themselves and others there, the Mohawk Valley, you see that happening there because you have a variety of German groups, Palatine Germans and others, the Herkimer and the others that live there. But William Johnson, it's not really a matter, the estate lord of Johnstown and so forth, he has several hundred tenants who are Scottish, and that came in a few years before that. They definitely went on different sides during the Revolution. Scots stayed with loyal to Johnson. Johnson died right before the war. His son, Guy Johnson. They stayed loyalists, and actually they joined some of the loyalist brigades, Butler's Rangers and others that moved into upstate New York and raid from that point on. And the German populations are those that settled really the rest of the Mohawk Valley, but they were definitely at odds with each other, drew on their own ethnic background to define themselves as well. There's obviously other variables involved. Some are tenants and some are freeholders, and they couldn't come to terms. You see something similar, I think, here in the Hudson Valley. Again, Palatine Germans who spoke primarily German came into Dutchess County and Westchester County in the 1740s, 50s, 60s. Not unimportant in the big rebellion of 1766, the land riots in 66 in Dutchess County. There you would have those groups, Palatine German, actually much like the groups in Mohawk, I voted about Mohawk Valley, also probably disproportionately join the Americans, are part of the Rebel Patriot cause. Now, Dutch is still spoken right through this revolution. Kingston, the trustees' records are half in Dutch, same author, half in English. Dutch words mixing with English words. The Dutch who have no necessary allegiance to the king in this, kind of split down the middle. But it started a generation earlier in the Conferetti Coitus church split of the 1730s, 1740s, and the Netherlands, which made its way here. So there is that I'm aware of, there's no one ethnic group that joined a specific side outside of their own part of the population. And the Mohawk Valley example I gave is the only one that stands out in my mind in New York. So,
Quick question. I'm sure you're familiar with what Ken Burns did.
sure, I should have mentioned that.
But I'm just wondering, did he do justice to New York and what he?
No, he didn't.
Oh, he did.
Ken Burns, who I think his Civil War story is magnificent. Very exciting with Ken Burns' Revolution series. It was very good. It was far better than anything I would ever do. It was the best thing I think that's been done on the American Revolution. But it is still overly focused on, I would say, New England. It's overly focused on certain elite groups. I think what it does very, very well, though, is two things. What it does in terms of how the First Peoples and how they were impacted, but also reveals the degree to which the American Revolution is really the U.S.'s first civil war. That most of the folks that are fighting by the end of the war are not British. The British Army is still here, but they declined in size dramatically. It's those Tory units, loyalist units. It's loyalists fighting against the revolutionary soldiers, the Continental Army, and again, there's more French helping them at that stage than there are Americans, even at Yorktown in particular. So, and it was really kind of evident it was there from the beginning, but it became more and more evident as the British started to kind of pull away from the major battles, which weren't working for them. So what I think the Burns series does very, very well is that these are people fighting each other. They were neighbors that are fighting each other by 1780, 1781. And that's the majority of the people fighting for the British are Americans. And again, majority of the forces at Yorktown under Washington are French. So it reveals other groups had an interest in this.
You'll have to send me your book.
Yes. One of the articles, I mentioned this, the Iris DeRoe, there is one who writes on the George Washington and Revolution, and she's featured in the Ken Burke series in terms of that. Just kind of triggered that. I wouldn't want to send the book and send the wrong message. Can I just thank you, folks?
You can, absolutely.
First of all, I want to thank my friends and family for coming here tonight and some folks. I also want to thank Mark and Donna, Mark Vanderheiden right here in the front on my left. 30 years ago, when I was a professor in South Carolina, and I came and interviewed at a job in Marist College then, that man hired me. I wouldn't have been studying in the Hudson Valley in the backcountry of South Carolina, I suspect. Just wanted to make note of that. Well, thank you.
Thank you.